Well, billionaire investor Lynn Tilton was on Powert Lunch yesterday, telling us exclusively why she's suing the SEC, which is accusing her of fraud. She has her doubts about whether investors triggered the SEC action.
I can categorically say that none of the investors raised these issues to me over the course of a decade. They've not pressed these arguments that the SEC now makes over more than a decade.
So it turns out Tilton had divided regulators. Public records show the SEC still decided to go after her following a 3-2 vote. Now, that is rare for that to happen. Usually the SEC likes to be unanimous. So joining me now is CNBC's Robert Frank and Eamon Javers. And Robert, what really stuck out here is that the SEC was divided down party lines. So the two Republican commissioners on the SEC that voted to not take any action against her. So can we surmise that there's some sort of political background here?
Well, you could look at that, but it's more the growing combination of facts around this case that make it increasingly complicated. So, number one, this is an investigation that took over 5 years. They are looking at an accounting methodology that she's been using for over 12 years. Plus, none of her investors, she says, has ever complained to her. So then the issue is, so who is the SEC representing? Who did they bring in on behalf of? And then as you get this split vote, 3-2, on an enforcement action in an administrative court where they have a near-perfect record during some periods, that's when it's to look like, well, maybe she has a point here in her own lawsuit.
Well, what do you think about this, Eamon? Do you think there is a political angle? I think it's been known that she has openly criticized the Obama administration on various points, but she's also, I think, been a Democratic donor in the past as well. So what do we know about any political affiliation, how that might play into this case?
That's right, Mandy. I mean, what's so fascinating about Lynn Tilton is she's not a particularly political person. She kind of swept into Washington in the wake of the financial crisis. I remember it well. She had some ideas about financial capital to turn around businesses. She hired a former McCain aide to kind of open doors and introduce her to people here in Washington, D.C. And in those years, she was very active in pushing her sort of big ideas about how to get out of the financial crisis. And she was also active as a political donor, but she gave money between 2005 and 2010 to both parties. Both Hillary Clinton and John McCain's Political Action Committee got checks from Lynn Tilton. But then after 2010, she stopped dead. I can't find a single campaign contribution from her after that point. She seems to have kind of lost interest in Washington and moved on with her life to the rest of her business. So not somebody who made a big impression in Washington. She came in very quickly and came out.
And what's really interesting about the timing here, 2010 is about when this investigation started. It's also the year that Lynn wrote an op-ed critical of the Obama administration. It's also the same period where she had a public disagreement with Valerie Jarrett during a business panel. And so, you know, if you're a political conspiracy theorist, you might say, well, the same year this investigation started is the year she became critical of the Obama administration and Valerie Jarrett. That's what some people are saying.
Eamon?
Yeah, look, I mean, there are a lot of business people who are critical of Valerie Jarrett. I mean, she is the Obama administration's point person in dealing with business folks. And I've talked to a number of business folks who just simply don't get along with Valerie, don't think she's the appropriate person to be in that role. But what's interesting about Lynn Tilton is that she came into Washington with sort of these big policy ideas. She wanted more finance, more capital going to turn around small businesses, particularly in manufacturing. That seems to have been something that captured her imagination, but relatively briefly, just for a couple of years, and then she was gone.
And the final note, the important thing I think here is the administrative court issue, which is her bone of contention. She said, look, if the SEC really has a case, bring it to a federal court. And a study showed that during a one-year period when the SEC brought actions, they won in federal court only 60% of the time, but they had a perfect record in the administrative court, where, by the way, the SEC hires the judges for the administrative court. So, gee, surprise, they have a perfect record in the court with which they hire. Now, they're using these administrative processes more and more. And I wonder, you know, and Eamon, we've seen more and more lawsuits because the SEC is using its own court more. We're also seeing more pushback, not just Lynn, but other people suing, saying, look, this is not right.
Yeah, and also I would say just generally, part of this is personal and stylistic. I mean, people who've worked with her describe her as, flamboyant and combative and brash. Those are things that don't necessarily make a good fit here in Washington, where the tone is a lot more buttoned down. So the sense was that Lynn Tilton was just not a good fit here in Washington, and that might be part of why she left and abandoned those efforts.
Yeah, buttoned down is not an
it's
adjective we would use for Lynn Tilton.
Okay, Robert and Eamon, very interesting story, and I have a feeling there's still a lot more to come on this as well. Ty, over to